Hello, learners, and welcome to the fifth lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century women's novels. To just briefly recap the content that's covered so far, I have provided an overview of the authors and the texts that we'll be covering in this course. And before that, I have undertaken somewhat detailed and somewhat thorough analysis of two different approaches to understanding writing or the intellectual production, not just creative writing, but other forms of discursive writing as well, writing in English by women in the 20th century. The first approach is based on identity, and the second approach is based on literary history. I will continue that discussion. I will continue to reflect directly and indirectly on these twin approaches to writing by women, and I will take the test case of Nella Larsen's novel Passing. I will talk in more detail about what this novel is about, what the really crucial and powerful questions this novel raises, and why we must pay attention to the issues, the question, and the people, the real human individuals, and their problems that this novel discusses. The first thing to note about this novel is its title. While it is a very accurate title and it does a good job of representing the content that readers can expect to find in this novel, it is also a somewhat misleading title. And it is misleading not in the sense that the writer or the narrator is being deliberately suspicious or is deliberately withholding information from readers. That's not the case. It's not that the narrator is unreliable. Rather, it is a very specific and calculated strategy, a rhetorical strategy on the part of the writer. What is this strategy and why is it misleading? In order to understand this, we will have to go a little bit into the literary history of African American writing in the early 20th century. And we will also have to think a little bit about the case, the biographical case of Nella Larsen. So the title Passing refers to a very common, very well-known phenomena. The phenomena is that of an individual who is born black, that is, who has African or African American descent in their lineage. That is to say, a person whose parents or grandparents or great-grandparents or someone in their family lineage was black. When such an individual, because they happen to have features, physical or visible features, such as the complexion of their skin, such as the shape of their faces, the textures, the shapes of their eyes, lips, nose, etc., any physiological or physiognomic feature that might resemble that of Caucasian or white race. When such an individual decides to pass themselves as white, right? That is the definition of passing. This definition was very widespread in early 20th century America. So when Nella Larsen, an African-American novelist, gives the title Passing to her novel, then it becomes very clear to readers that the intellectual and emotional complexity of this document, the reason readers should give their attention to this story, will involve the shifting or passing nature or changing nature of identity. That is a very clear expectation that the word passing creates when Nella Larsen chooses that word as its title. However, while this is not untrue, the novel does describe many aspects related to racial passing. The novel describes the lives of at least two, maybe even three individuals whose trajectory coincides with that of passing. That is to say, there are at least two, if not more, individuals in this novel, characters in this novel, who do this, whose actions meet the description of passing, who pass, in other words. And while they pass, they also deal with the emotional anxieties, the complexities, the trepidation, the fear, the ambition, the rationalization, the whole psychological gamut of experiences that passing accompanies. The novel describes all of these things. So it is an accurate title. However, the novel also describes another set of ideas, feelings, and emotions. This set of ideas and emotions are not, strictly speaking, the consequence of racial passing. In fact, they have very little to do with race. Nonetheless, they are connected in very subtle and very clear and very unmistakable ways to the tensions that are unleashed by racial passing. What is this other set of concerns? This other set of concerns has to do with relationships of intimacy, friendship, or romantic love between individuals of the same sex. This set of concerns was not as widespread or not as publicly recognized as that of racial passing in early 20th century America. In fact, not only was queerness or same sex intimacy not as widely known, and it did not enjoy as much legitimacy as same sex passing, but in fact, the atmosphere was quite homophobic. So while it was quite easy and acceptable to describe racial passing, in fact, there existed quite a bit of literature as well as activism which would very naturally support the description of passing. The same did not exist for queerness or same sex intimacy. So, while from the 19th century onwards, from as early a time as there existed slavery or chattel slavery, as it is called, passing was a phenomenon. Because there were some states in which African American bodies were treated as the property of their white owners, and there were some other states in which African American bodies were not treated as property. African American communities had devised a range of coping survival mechanisms in order to deal with these historical forces. And along with modes of survival, passing was one such mode of survival. So it was quite easy to win respect and acceptance for descriptions of racial passing in African American literature. The same did not exist, however, for descriptions of same sex relationships. And because of this difference, many scholars and commentators and many of the most perceptive readers of this novel have suggested that the strategy adopted by Nella Larsen in this book, Passing, is to use the idea of racial passing as a cover, as a smokescreen, in the way that individuals in sport or war use dummies or covering mechanisms while they distract their opponents by giving them an appearance of something. And while their opponents are distracted, they secretly or in less visible manners do something else. So the scholar who suggested that in the context of Nella Larsen's Passing was Deborah McDowell. And in the 1986, I believe, edition of the Rutgers University Press edition of Nella Larsen's two novels, that is Quicksand and Passing, Deborah McDowell wrote an introduction which very powerfully introduced this theme through a very perceptive reading of both of these novels. What is that reading and how can we make sense of it? Deborah McDowell's point is that sexuality and not race is actually the main concern, the main focus of Nella Larsen's two novels, Quicksand and Passing. However, this is not to say that racial passing is not important or that questions of racial identity or racial discrimination or racial inequality are not important. Rather, these become more important when we see or when we pay attention to the manner in which questions of sexuality are brought to the fore through a description of questions of race. So questions of race are obviously important, they set the foundation for an exploration, for an intellectual inquiry into matters of even more central human importance for the novel. So, while questions of race are foundational to this novel, the novel is actually chasing a higher, more complex, higher stakes intellectual goal. While reflection on matters of race is important, it is preliminary. It is something that the novel does only to get itself off the mark, as it were. Once it has gotten itself off the mark, once it has established the foundation of this inquiry into matters of race, it begins to explore questions of a somewhat different nature, questions regarding the nature of same sex relationships, questions about the value and the place of sexuality, and more specifically, the value and the place of sexuality in the lives of African American women. Even more specifically, to what extent could African American women, especially light skinned African American women, make their sexuality or their ability to feel sexual desire or attraction towards another African American woman, light skinned or not? To what extent could this liberty be taken? And to what extent was such claim, such a taking of liberty, legitimate and acceptable within the African American society of its time? To make this claim, Deborah McDowell situates Nella Larsen in the context of early 20th century African American novels. What McDowell demonstrates is that there are a great deal of representations of African American women in this time period, which took a very derogatory, somewhat stereotypical, and often misogynist view about the nature of sexuality that African American women lived with or were susceptible to. Often, the highly misogynist view taken by many novelists was that African American women were susceptible to a very primitive and uncivilized form of sexuality, almost nymphomaniacal forms of sexuality. And this was something that Nella Larsen was very aware of and felt very keenly that she would like to challenge this sort of tendency in her own novel. So, Quicksand, the first novel that Nella Larsen wrote, and which in a way anticipated and created the grounds for the description of sexuality and agency in the next novel, that is Passing. Quicksand is not really about passing, but Quicksand is more about the struggles, the travails of one African American woman. And Deborah McDowell demonstrates how the struggles of this African American woman comes precisely from being unable to reconcile herself to either of two or three extreme views about the relationship between sexuality and race. What are these extreme views? There's one camp which believed very strongly that African American women must be extremely moralistic and moralist in their behavior, in the conduct of themselves and their bodies in public. On the other hand, there was a more libertine view, which had a lot to do with the Harlem Renaissance, in which complete and extremely liberal perspective was taken. And in this view, it was believed that there was no need for any sort of sexual or moral policing. And in fact, a sort of promiscuity was encouraged and seen as almost the imperative of the African American woman. The protagonist of Quicksand, Larsen's first novel, shuttles violently between these extremes, and the problems and the agitation and the anxiety and the turbulence that this individual experiences has to do with the irreconcilable nature of these extreme perspectives. Coming to the second novel, Passing represents a sort of high point, intellectually speaking, in Larsen's oeuvre and writing career, because the exploration of the place of sexuality in the life of an African American woman is combined with, integrated with many other equally relevant sociological as well as intellectual concerns that governed the life and thinking of the African American community. So, what are these concerns? There is, on one hand, the question of negritude. The Harlem Renaissance represented an intellectual movement in which several writers and scholars began to speak in a powerful and affirmative new language about the meaning of Black identity. They universalized Blackness and negritude and encouraged writers from the African American community to look inwards, to think about themselves as part of a very unique and powerful genealogy as well as tradition. So, writers like Langston Hughes and several others encouraged Black writers or Negro writers to devise new forms of art, which they also call sometimes Negro art. And they encourage writers to think of themselves not simply as writers, because to do so would mean inevitably to repeat or replicate definitions of art and aesthetics which had been created by white artists and which seem to support the interests and sometimes white supremacist and somewhat racist community. So, this intellectual affirmation of Blackness and negritude was one of the cultural consequences of the Harlem Renaissance. On the other hand, the Harlem Renaissance took place at a time when the African American community had also begun to enjoy a great deal of economic and social progress. The early 20th century is the time of the Jim Crow era. This was a time of segregation, sure. This was a time of discrimination, sure. This was a time before civil rights were real, sure. But this was also a time when the violence of the previous century had ended. This was also a time when laws existed that prevented the exploitation and violence against Black people and the African American community. So, relative to the 19th century, the African American community in the 1920s had begun to enjoy clear signs of economic and social upliftment. There were problems, yes, and let me be very clear, I'm not saying that this was a time of economic prosperity, but relative to the 19th century, there was a difference. And there was something which had begun to make its appearance for the first time in the history of the American nation. This was the Black middle class. Something like the Black middle class did not exist in the 19th century. However, this group of people existed, this community existed, and it was growing. This community, while it was growing, it had to deal with a lot of contradictions. It had to deal with a lot of difficult choices. It had to make decisions. It had to choose between things that were often quite difficult. So, for instance, the question of assimilation became more and more important. As more and more Black people began to receive an education, began to get into positions of financial stability, well-being, education, professional education, the ability to choose a job, to do a job, and to choose one's vocation. All of these opportunities also brought with them some difficult choices. These choices were difficult because prior to this, all definitions of what counted as the good life, the good job, or the good education, all of these things were defined by white individuals or the white community. So there was a vacuum because there was an absence of Black-oriented and Black-defined notions of goodness, success, prosperity, power, well-being, comfort, stability, and so on. So because of this vacuum, many newly educated, financially comfortable Black individuals tended to appropriate models of success and well-being which were originally created by white people. Now, of course, many in the Harlem Renaissance and writers like Langston Hughes and several others who wrote about negritude, who wrote about Negro art, Negro culture, Negro life negritude, and so on. These writers and scholars warned individuals against making those mistakes, and they constantly encouraged successful, powerful, choice making Black individuals to make choices that ultimately reflected their universal and essential negritude. However, there were many who made less informed choices. There were many who lacked this intellectual perspective. And so we see many of these people from the newly emerging Black middle class, educated with the ability to hold any job they wanted, making good money or at least decent money, even if not making enough money as their counterparts from the white race, but still making enough money to leave poverty, to hold down a white collar job, and to have access to all of the leisures and recreations that genteel people had access to. There were a lot of these people who were making choices and who tended to sometimes forget that ideas of success were created by white people, and they sometimes did not choose Negro forms of entertainment. We meet a lot of these people in the novels of Nella Larsen. In fact, the protagonists of Passing, Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield, they very powerfully represent these tensions, these contradictions, and the problems that could emerge if these choices were not thought through very carefully. So, this is the economic question, or the newly ascendant economic power of the Black middle class, is something that complicates very powerfully earlier questions of passing. And this is something that I want to note as we begin our textual analysis of Nella Larsen's novel Passing. There were other novels about passing. It's not that Nella Larsen was a pioneer who chose to write a novel about passing. There were others as well. But what makes Larsen's novels unique is the fact that they are Larsen's passing characters. They are unique because they come from the Black middle class. They do not pass to survive. That is the key difference. And there were iconic African American as well as white American novelists who wrote about passing earlier. One example of a writer is Jessie Fawcett, who wrote the novel Plum Bun. Another novelist is Walter White, who wrote the novel Flight. Another contemporary white novelist who wrote about passing is Fannie Hurst, who wrote the novel Imitation of Life. What is different between these novels on one hand and Larsen's novel Passing on the other is that the characters who pass, they do not do it in order to survive. This is the key thing, that the characters in these other novels are all working class characters. They pass because if they did not pass, they would be forced to live a life of abject poverty. And the professions that were open to them without passing were those of maids, washerwomen, or menial laborers of some sort. This is not the case for characters in Nella Larsen's novel Passing. The one character has a real fear of extreme poverty, but most other characters do not have this fear. So why do they pass? This is the first question. They pass because they have certain motivations of their own, which have something to do with the disadvantages of the Black and African American community in early 20th century America. But, and this is key, these motivations for passing are not solely material, they're not solely economic, and they're not solely sociological either. This is the first and very powerful point to note about Nella Larsen's Passing. Questions of choice. The individuals who pass in her novels, they make choices. And it is a choice in the very pure philosophical, intellectual sense of the word choice, in the sense that the individual who chooses to pass could have very easily chosen not to. They chose to pass because they felt that the balance tipped in favor of passing, but there were no obvious reasons that would have compelled them to pass. There were obvious reasons for characters in earlier novels. As I mentioned, in the time of chattel slavery and before the abolition of slavery, before Black people had the opportunity to get an education and jobs, before these things happened, passing was a matter of survival. African American individuals passed if they could, because that was literally their chance of survival. This distinguishes Nella Larsen's novel because it introduces a very powerful element of inscrutability into the decisions made by her characters. The choice to pass is an inscrutable decision because these individuals could survive. They could have an acceptable life. They could have a decently satisfying life, even if they did not pass. If they continued to live according to the conditions of the race they were born as. But they had a choice of passing because they had features, visible features, facial features, or skin color, which enabled them to pass, which presented them with this opportunity to present themselves as white instead of Black. But when they chose to do this, they were simply making a choice. They were accepting that they wanted something more than what was simply given to them. They articulated a desire for a life that was better than what would be available to them if they lived according to the fate that was given to them, according to the race that they were born as. So they're making a choice and they are expressing a desire. It's a desire because it is in the realm of something they want and maybe not in the realm of something they need. In fact, this question of a difference between a need and a want, between survival and comfort, or survival and leisure, or survival and wanting a good life, not just being alive, but wanting a good life. These are the questions which motivate these characters. They do not want to simply survive, but they want a good life. This is what distinguishes the Black characters in Larsen's novel from the Black characters in other novels who also decide to pass. I will end this lecture here and continue this discussion of choice and agency in the next lecture. Thank you.